All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 180. We're going to be discussing visionary psychedelic science with Andrew Gallimore. We've had Andrew on the show before. I think it's been a while. I think the episode we did with him was number 72, if I'm not mistaken. It was a really great episode. It was when his book, Alien Information Theory, just came out, so I still highly recommend people read that if you are into psychedelics and DMT and stuff, and you want to know the science side of it and what's going on with the serotonin receptors and all that. I think it's an amazing book. And also, you can check us out at Patreon at patreon.com/mindescapepodcast. For just $2 a month, you'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. We did one earlier with Avi Loeb, who is the Harvard physicist that theorized that Oumuamua was actually an extraterrestrial, offshoot or piece of something. So check that out. And we have a little bit of a science palooza today now that Andrew's on. So 2 episodes in one day,
Absolutely.
both scientists, 2 first for Mind Escape, which is amazing. And one more thing, go to indrasweb.org. This is the social media platform that we created to connect open minds. So if you want to speculate, hypothesize, theorize, talk about all the kind of stuff that we talk about on the show and all the different topics, it's the perfect place for it. We're trying to build a community of like-minded people, so go check that out. And without further ado, welcome on the show. Andrew, or should I say welcome back?
Great to be here again.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's been, I think, almost like 2 years now. You were actually one of the first bigger, well-known, I think, psychedelic scientists that we've had on the show. So it's good to have you back on.
Yeah, I think it was during that kind of initial. I did a flurry of these kind of podcasts at the time, so I often struggle to differentiate between.
Yeah, I can't
them.
believe it's been 2 years. That's insane.
So you're saying you don't remember us?
I remember you.
Oh, okay.
How could I not remember you? Yeah, obviously. But yeah, I did quite a few at the time. So this is the first time I've done a podcast in a few months. I've been focusing on writing and isolating, as everyone's doing at the moment. So yeah, I haven't done much in the way of kind of talking to the public. So yeah, you'll be one of the first.
I saw you were hanging out with the Dreaming Jaguar guys. Was that recent, or was that shot and then just released?
That was more than a year ago, I think.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
that was great. I mean, we didn't hang out. They sent me some questions, and then I recorded them with my friend on the beach in Okinawa, and then they kind of recorded their bit. So it was kind of a collaborative effort. But yeah, I've never met them, not yet.
Yeah, they're good dudes. Paul and Justin.
Yeah.
Shout out to Paul and Justin. So last time we had you on, we pretty much focused on your book and your theory. Has there been any changes in your own, work or theory? Like, have you altered anything, or have you changed anything, or the way you think about it, or?
Well, I'm never kind of settled on what I think's going on, and I don't think anyone should be when it comes to things like DMT. I think it's always an open question, and anyone who ever tells you that they've got it worked out is lying, basically, because I don't think any of us really have a clue. I mean, the book that I wrote, which of course everyone should buy, Alien Information. Oh, you can't see it. Oh my god.
Yeah, it's the green screen's black. I have the link down below. His website's down below, and you can go buy his book on his website.
Yeah, I mean, the book that I wrote was, and some people kind of think of it as my worldview, as in this is what I think is absolutely the truth about DMT, but I would never make such a grand claim. It's really, it's my kind of vision. It's a vision of reality that I'm kind of putting out there and saying, hey, reality is really fucking strange, and maybe it's something like this, based upon my own experiences with the molecule and other people's experiences and what I understand about the brain and how the brain constructs your reality. And thinking about the fundamental structure of reality as well, and kind of new ideas about information being kind of foundational. I kind of put together this, what really is a work of art in a sense, in that it's a coherent narrative, but it's never settled. I certainly don't think that it's it's certainly not a gospel by any stretch of the imagination. It's just me kind of trying to put together something that attempts to point towards understanding of what DMT is and how it relates to who we are and where we came from and where we might be going in the future, I think.
Have you seen that new DMT Quest documentary on YouTube by any chance?
I'm ashamed to say it's on my list of things to watch, yes, but I haven't seen it yet, no. But
Okay,
I hear good things about it.
there was something I was going to ask, so related to that 2019 U of M study, where they found DMT like in the fluid, like spinal fluid and different parts of, the brain fluids and stuff like that. And so they were talking about possibly maybe all psychedelics play off of these DMT enzymes in some way or at some point, and that's actually at the root of all of these experiences.
Well, I mean, so we know that, I mean, this is a contentious area in that people are always arguing about this and about what it means. I mean, we know that DMT is found it's in the human body. It's been detected. I mean, people have been looking for DMT in bodily fluids, in blood and urine, basically, for decades now. Really, I mean, seriously, since the 60s, really, because originally there was a kind of a hypothesis about psychotic states like schizophrenia, that they might be generated by the kind of the aberrant or abnormal production of psychedelic tryptamines inside the human body, and that people who had some imbalance or abnormal expression of certain enzymes in tryptophan metabolism would produce elevated amounts of psychedelic tryptamines in their brain, and this would be responsible for their psychosis. I mean, the idea has largely been dropped now, simply because schizophrenia isn't a DMT state. It's far different. It's far more complex and nuanced than that, and deeper in many senses. It has many different kind of characteristics and facets, and it's certainly not. If you've got schizophrenia, you're not walking around in a DMT state all the time. But again, these are the kind of the processes that one goes through as a scientist and a psychiatrist or whatever. And these people are interested in the brain and in the states of consciousness and that kind of thing. These are sort of ideas that are really important. Most hypotheses are eventually discounted, but they all add to our understanding. So we know that DMT is produced by the human. It's in the human body. It's almost certainly produced in the human brain. But what does that actually mean is a completely different question. People will say, and again, you can trace this back to papers that really originate in the 1980s, and Terence McKenna kind of popularized certain ideas that perhaps DMT is responsible for the dream state, or DMT is released by the pineal gland at death and is responsible for the exit of the soul from the body. And that comes from Rick Strassman, of course, in DMT, the spirit molecule. But all of this is wild speculation that is not really backed up by any kind of real scientific data or evidence. So I think the jury is still out as to what is the role, if any, of DMT in the human body. Just because you find DMT in the human body does not mean that it has an important function, because DMT is produced by two very, very simple enzymatic chemical reactions. You start with tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid. And from tryptophan, you can make lots of different molecules, some of which are really important, like serotonin, for example, is a tryptamine. It's 5-hydroxytryptamine. Melatonin is also a tryptamine. So it isn't surprising that you would find these kind of intermediates or these what are called shunt products, so molecules that are kind of produced in very, very small amounts, but not really of any kind of significance. On the other hand, it's also possible that they do have some kind of physiological relevance, but what that is isn't clear. More recently, people have suggested, and maybe it's covered in that DMT Quest documentary, is the idea that, or the observation really, that DMT can help protect cells in a hypoxic state. So when a cell is starved of oxygen, it risks dying. Undergoes this kind of oxidative stress, and basically it starts to kind of commit cell suicide. And DMT might be useful in actually preventing cell death, and so protect the brain specifically under conditions in which oxygen levels are dropping, which kind of relates to the idea of death or close to death, when the heart function is collapsing, respiratory function is collapsing, and the brain is becoming starved of oxygen, that there might be some mechanism to release large amounts of DMT into the brain that would help to protect the brain should you be revived. Obviously, if you end up dying, then it's irrelevant. But should you survive, then elevated levels of DMT during those hypoxic states might help protect the brain from long-term damage. And of course, if you were in that state, you would be having a DMT experience during that period. And if you came back, you might say, "Well, I had this incredible experience, when I was being resuscitated, or whatever." But again, speculation.
Yeah. There actually was a recent paper I just read about DMT being used to help treat people that have had strokes. Have you seen that paper?
Yeah, so this is kind of widely reported in the last week or so. The idea that DMT, because what's kind of interesting about some of these psychedelic tryptamines, including psilocybin, is that they promote neurogenesis. They help the sort of brain cells to kind of regenerate. Either to produce new brain cells or to increase the number of connections. So basically allowing the brain to kind of rewire itself. And when you have a stroke, basically what happens in simple terms is that areas of the brain that are starved of oxygen for extended periods of time, they start to die. Neurons start to die off. So the idea is that if you can deliver DMT in a sub-psychedelic dose, so they're not talking about giving stroke patients 50 milligrams of DMT in one kind of shot, but rather to deliver DMT at a very low sub-psychedelic level, and that this might help to either protect the brain cells or even to help them to recover and to regenerate in the recovery phase. But again, this is I think there's been some kind of approval for these initial kind of studies, but whether it comes to fruition remains to be seen. But it just shows you, I think, that the kind of the role of psychedelics in medicine is going to be revolutionary. You can obviously there's the studies that have been going on for a few years now, looking at psychedelics as treatments for depression or anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, sort of the more kind of neuropsychological condition. But we might find that they have roles in other neurological conditions as well, including stroke or dementia, Alzheimer's. Who knows?
I want to ask you about another article, paper that was recently released about how people look at scientists or psychedelic scientists differently if they've actually done psychedelics. Have you read that?
So I've seen posts about it, yeah, but I haven't read the original paper.
I mean, obviously, I probably know your take on it, but what do you think about that? Is that a people problem, or is that like a perception problem? Like, what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think I guess there's an illusion that scientists are objective, or there's certainly the belief that scientists should be objective. And if you are, if you've taken psychedelics and you've kind of you had these experiences, that you might in some way be compromised in a sense. if you've got shares in a company and you're writing papers about how amazing this company is, then people are going to, it's conflict of interest. So I think there's an element of that, right? Obviously, that maybe people who have taken these molecules are compromised, and obviously there's also a general negative attitude. Still, I mean, it's diminishing now, but there's still a negative attitude to people who take drugs. And so a scientist who admits to having taken drugs, whether psychedelics or otherwise, might also be seen as compromised in some way, and some kind of hippie or crackhead or whatever, someone who perhaps shouldn't be listened to. But I obviously I would disagree with that. I think there's also, for many people within the kind of psychedelic community, not really, within the kind of psychedelic space, psychedelic arena, there's a suspicion of scientists that haven't taken psychedelic drugs. So scientists who talk about the effects of LSD in rats or even in humans that have never actually experienced it. People think, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. Because you don't have this first-hand experience of what is actually happening, and certainly with something like DMT. I mean, personally myself, I'm always suspicious of people who say DMT it's just a hallucination. It's just the brain, manufacturing these hallucinations. And I'm always of the position that if you're going to talk about DMT, you should take it, because it's the only surefire convincer really is to smoke it and actually see what you are dismissing. Because
it's been 2 years since we had you on. We still haven't tried it. It's the only psychedelic we really haven't done. I will say I am offering up my services for future studies. I do have OCD too, so that might be something that might interest somebody out there.
It might help, yeah. So yeah, I think it's easy to dismiss things when you haven't actually experienced them. It's easy to say, oh, it's just a hallucination. But once you've been there, man, and it's like, okay, now maybe there is something else going on here, because that I cannot explain.
Do you think it's also too, there's obviously a lot of people that are interested in the entities and the machine elves and, this possibly some sort of metaphysical external thing happening. Do you think that when somebody, like I said, like some scientist who's never done psychedelics is saying, oh, that couldn't possibly be the case, that's where the pushback on, on that end of things comes in, because you have it kind of the opposite of what you're saying. Like there's the people that just don't think psychedelics or drugs are helpful in any way. Obviously those people have no idea what they're talking about in terms of, this visionary progressive science. But then you have the other side of it too, where you have some of these materialist dogmatic scientists saying, this, and then there's people in the psychedelic community that are put off by that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, because on the one hand, I personally, I'm kind of agnostic on these things. I try not to go in with a kind of definitive belief of to what's actually going on, and yeah, certainly it's easy to say that these entities are cannot possibly exist, and then if you're kind of orthodox scientist, you might go into psychedelics with that assumption that these must be mere hallucination, and that the role is to kind of explain them in terms of that, in those kind of orthodox neuroscientific terms. And then on the other hand, you've got on the other side of that spectrum, you've got the people who are talking about spirits, plant spirits, or the Akashic records, and you get into this kind of this mysticism and occult, and these things, they find it very, very difficult to mesh with each other.
And it's water and oil.
Exactly.
And I like both, though. I like both.
Well, I don't like either.
Hey, see?
In that, I mean, I respect both viewpoints. I'm not going to question people's mystical beliefs about things. I would never dream of doing that. And people have different worldviews, but
Right.
it's not helpful for me to go in with either of those positions. I don't go in saying, okay, the machine elves are pure cortical fabrications. They're pure fabrications of the brain. Nor do I go in and say that these are fire spirits from the mystical forest or something like this. I made that up, but you get the idea. And so I don't think either position really helps you out. Once you've said, okay, these are spirits from the astral plane, where do you go from there? It's all been explained. We don't need evidence. We don't need to research it. We don't need to think about it. That's what they are. That's a kind of that's an ideology, really, that it's a dogmatic position that is no more helpful.
So your position, and just to make this clear, is that you are open-minded to anything, but you're going to follow the research and the science and see, based on that and based on your own theories and stuff like that. Meaning, if the science led to something external or metaphysical, then you would be open to it. Some may not be, but it sounds like you're just reserved in the sense that you're going to just see where the science goes with it.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, but I tread a fine line, admittedly. I mean, many sort of more kind of straight scientists, so to speak, would see me as being far out, whereas many kind of the more mystical kind of New Age, dare I say, kind of people see me as being this awful materialist reductionist who's trying to take away the magic of DMT. So I don't fit into either world.
just
I don't
can't
think
win.
that at all. I think you're visionary. That's why, like I said, we had two visionary. We had Avi Loeb talking, from Harvard, talking about extraterrestrial, things out in space, and we have you talking about these crazy experiments that might link us to something else, some other sort of intelligence. So I think that.
Well, yeah.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with it.
We're all about thinking outside the box, pushing that envelope.
Yeah, and I would like to point out, though, I think I'm pretty well read in philosophy of the mind, and stuff like that. And with my OCD, I found that the more mystical the psilocybin experience is, the more it helps me. And it's the mystical side of it. It's not the compounds in general, in my opinion, because I've tried, different extractions and different things, and it's the all-in-one package that does it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're using psychedelics, then what's going on in the brain is, if you're using psychedelics for, exploring your consciousness, trying to see what are the limits of your conscious experience, or to deal with some issue that you've got that you want to kind of bring to the surface, then how it works is not really that important. But for me, I like to reach out into other possibilities and think, well, actually, we don't really know what is going on at all. We have a kind of framework of trying to understand reality and understand the brain, but we don't really know what is and isn't possible, and that's the danger is in ruling out certain possibilities as being impossible. That's not possible. It's not possible that DMT could facilitate communication with some other orthogonal intelligence. That's not possible. So we can forget that. I am like picking those kind of pieces up off the floor and saying, actually, I'd like to look at this a bit more, because you're doing all the straight scientists, so to speak, are doing all of that very important work, by the way. The Imperial team, massive respect. They are leading the world in understanding what's actually going on in the brain. And if you read any of my works, I'm always referring to the science. I always keep one foot very firmly in the science, but then I kind of reach with the other foot and the other hands into some really speculative territory, whilst keeping my feet on the ground within the science. And I think that's important. Otherwise, anything goes. You can say whatever you like, and people do. People come up with some wild theories all the time. I get messages from people and say, hey man, can you, hey dude,
Hey.
can we, can you chat with me? I get messages from people I don't know saying, "Hey, can we have a Skype, man?" And it's just I've got some
You should
weird.
tell them, be like, start a podcast, then get back to me.
That's what I do. I said, this is a general message to people. Don't message me and say, "Can we have a discussion about your theories?" Because
we get those too. And I'm not even a scientist. I just say things on a podcast sometimes, and people send me messages about that. So I can't even imagine if you wrote a book.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I don't really have much to say. I can't really say much about other people's experiences. It's up to them to make sense of them. And if they've got some wild theory that they want to put out there, then write a book, write a paper,
or come on to Indra's. Go to Indra's web. We'll get you sign up for a profile.
Plug.
Yeah, sign up for a profile. You can talk about whatever you want. If it's the most speculative, thing regarding psychedelics or DMT, let's hear it. Let's see what people say about it. We'll let the people decide. But yeah, I mean, this is a weird space though, because we don't really know what consciousness is, right? There's speculations, there's different theories. You have like Stuart Hameroff stuff with Roger Penrose. You have, other Anil Seth. You have some of these scientists doing these kind of I call it speculation because I don't really see anything too sticky in terms of it actually sticking and staying there. But I read a paper, it was from Duke University, about fMRIs and how they did this study where they had all these people come in and they recorded brain function. And I guess most people think they're like recording neuron actions and stuff like that. They don't. They just record the blood flow to certain areas of the brain, and that's what an fMRI is. And they found that the people that came back after they recorded the first function came back and like 90% of them used different parts of their brain for the same function. So they said they have to throw away all the data recorded of all these fMRIs, because what does that mean if there isn't consistent, do you know what I'm saying? So like that's for me, when we talk about consciousness and like psychedelics and anecdotal experiences, it's like, well, what are we talking about? Because if somebody had this real experience that they believe and everything's real within that realm, and they come back and it's not the same thing, like what's going on here?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a messy area. I think with consciousness, certainly, we know that it exists. It's the only thing that we know exists that we cannot deny. You can never deny. Descartes famously attempted, was able to, with this kind of Cartesian skepticism, was able to deny pretty much everything. Well, everything really, apart from his own mind.
Right.
And so that's the only thing. We know that consciousness exists, and we know that it's structured. We know that it contains information, because that is your experience, right? You live in a world, what we generally refer to as the phenomenal world, which is your own irrevocably subjective personal world, the only world really you will ever know. And it has structure, it's full of information. And we know that somehow the way that this consciousness is structured relates to brain activity, in that different patterns of information in the brain relate to different patterns of experience. But what is the relationship there? Is it the same thing? Is there, are you a dualist, for example? Do you think that the brain is somehow interfacing with consciousness, or some way transmitting consciousness, or is it all part of the same thing? Is there only consciousness? Perhaps you're an idealist and you think that the brain is part of consciousness in some way. And there are many ways, and I avoid it a little bit because it is such a slippery and really it's a very philosophical kind of issue. So I avoid talking too much about consciousness, and I think that leads some people to misunderstand my work, in that I'm neglecting consciousness, or I'm ignoring consciousness. I'm not. If anything, I'm an idealist. I think that consciousness is in some way fundamental. I don't think it can be explained in terms of anything else.
So you're more on the phenomenological end of things than mechanistic, then, would you say?
Well, I mean, I'm very mechanistic in that I understand.
But I just mean you lean towards more of the believing in, what could be on the end of the phenomenology aspect of it. Like you said, it's fundamental, or panpsychism, or whatever you want to call it, where just consciousness is fundamental throughout the universe.
Yes, I think that's the direction that I would lean. What I know is that what we understand from neuroscience over the last several decades is that certain brain states, certain patterns of activity that are generated by the cortex result in or mapped to certain phenomenological states. So we know that when a certain part of the visual cortex is active, that the individual is going to be seeing the color red, for example, or that certain patterns will be associated with certain features and structures in the world. How that works, why these patterns, the way I always describe it is, we don't really know why these patterns of information generated by the brain feel like something, but they do. Your world really is what your phenomenal world, the world you experience, your subjective world, is what these patterns of information generated by your brain feel like from your subjective perspective. Why that's the case? Why does a brain? What's special about the information that the brain generates that it has the quality of subjectivity? That's a great mystery. And there are scientists like Giulio Tononi, for example, in Wisconsin, who has developed something called integrated information theory, which posits that consciousness is this quantity that he calls phi, which is integrated information. It's a little bit complicated, but basically it's a special type of information. And when information has this certain quality of being integrated, it is consciousness. And so the brain there is a subjective quality to brain activity because the brain is generating this special type of integrated information. And in fact, I wrote a paper called Restructuring Consciousness, the Psychedelic State from the Perspective of Integrated Information Theory, if you want to look up that, where I think about how psychedelics affect information in the brain and how that relates to integrated information theory, and why psychedelic states, how they kind of restructure your phenomenal world.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting discussion. You brought up Descartes, and we could talk about like the dualism thing. It's all this stuff's weird. When you even dualism, there are some interesting things. Like if you go back to Leibniz, however you want to pronounce it, law of indiscernibles. For two things to be the same, mind and body, or they have to all be exactly the same, which they're not. So and when you're talking about that, we're talking about very interesting stuff. So that's why I do like the consciousness's primary theory too. For I go back and forth on it, but I do like that as my current state of mind on those things. When you look at what's going on with psychedelic science, there's a lot of these companies, getting on the stock market. There's a lot of money to be made. This is kind of Maurice knows, he's all into the stock market stuff.
Yes, sir.
Do you think that becomes an issue at any point, or do you think that becomes helpful?
It could go both ways, I think. I think people are understandably concerned about, when people come in with money and are setting up companies, and there are a flurry of these companies now. You can look at it both ways, and I don't think either is the correct way. One way you could say, great, we've got people actually putting money in now and spending money to develop these tools for use in treating psychiatric conditions, and that's a wonderful thing, because these are tools, these are medicines, or can be used as medicines, and we need to work out what's the best way to do that, and that takes research, it takes time, it takes money. So bringing the money into the psychedelic space is really important. On the other hand, you get this kind of land grabbing. I think people are concerned that certain companies, I'm not going to name any, but there are a handful out there that are taking out what appear to be kind of trivial patents.
Yeah, I've been noticing that too. Even one tried to patent, I think, psilocybin. I didn't even know if that was possible. Isn't that a scientific term?
Well, yeah, you can't patent. What you can do is patent formulations. So I think that what they were trying to, well, one particular patent was putting psilocybin into capsules. You know, I mean, it just.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to see how that could be patentable or seen as novel that's worthy of a patent. And there's also, how you use them. So I think I saw one just last week was trying to patent laying on a couch with eye patches. What do you call them? Yeah.
Oh yeah, like
blindfolding.
Sleeping mask.
Yeah,
sleeping mask and listening to music, and that this would be their novel approach. I mean, people have been doing that for
patent
decades.
Music? That's a good idea.
When you're taking psychedelics, yeah. So if you're taking psychedelics in a therapeutic context with music on, that they were trying to patent that, and I think people are reasonably saying, okay, come on.
That's unbelievable.
I don't have a problem if people have developed a new molecule and it's taken millions of dollars to develop this and test this molecule. I have no problem, because they have to be able to make the money back somehow. Otherwise, they're not going to do the research in the first place. But when people start, to me, feel like rather spurious patents, patenting, for example, deuterated analogues, where you replace the hydrogens with deuterium, which is a heavier isotope of hydrogen. I'm slightly skeptical that this is going to have a significant effect. Yes, they might be metabolized slightly slower. It might have some kind of therapeutic benefit. But to be honest, I don't really see it. I think the duration of action of psilocybin is already in the hours, 2 or 3 hours. So I don't see why. And you can always add, take more or less, or etc. So I don't necessarily see why that's a thing. It feels like people are just trying to get patents to kind of take their bit of the space and essentially lock other people out, and that's a concern.
I think it's like, I think it has to do with the integrity of the company, like you were saying. Like I don't know if you're familiar with GW Pharma. They were like the first cannabis medical company to patent the drugs for the seizures, and they were leaders in their class, and they actually had to step outside the box because people were very concerned with giving CBDs to children. Obviously, we've came a long way from there. So yeah, it's all about the integrity of the company. And I mean, when you get into the stocks and stuff, when money gets involved, then integrity can get shifted pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think you have to strike a balance, and I think these companies should be held account. People should be, looking at them very, very carefully at what they're doing. But at the same time, there are also kind of other extremists that say, no, you should only take psilocybin that have been, or only take mushrooms that have been, plucked from the ground and blessed by a Mexican shaman.
So I was going to actually ask about that aspect of things. Well, to the point though, I think that the stock market stuff's fine. I think, like you said, the problem for me comes in with trying to patent stuff and molecules and names and things like that. When you start to get into the realm of, when they do these studies, everything's isolated. It's just psilocybin, pure psilocybin, or it's pure DMT, or it's pure MDMA, or whatever the case may be. How do you think about that? Because, is there enough studies going into the full entourage effect and how those help people? Because, let me ask you this as a second part. Yeah. Do you feel like scientists in a way owe something to psychedelic users and to clandestine chemists and things like that? Because these are the people that perpetuated this when, after 1970, this whole thing went away kind of. So, I mean, in reality, it's like people that kept this thing alive, and now scientists are able to get back in there and do this kind of research.
100%. Yeah, I mean, it is, as you say, it is the underground. Well, basically the underground. Until very, very recently, all of this was technically underground, and it was underneath the constraints of the law, or outside the constraints of the law. So yeah, without a doubt. For me, I mean, certainly with DMT, the underground community is extremely important, because they're the ones that are developing new ways of taking DMT, for example. I mean, even in terms of kind of personal use of DMT. If you want to take DMT now, the way that you would take DMT in 2021 is very different from the way that Terence McKenna was taking DMT in the 1980s, in that we now understand much more efficient and cleaner ways of extracting it. The kind of the natural sources, for one thing. Where can you find DMT in reasonably high concentrations in the natural world? We know a lot more about that now. How to extract and purify DMT, and indeed how to ingest it. Whether you use the old traditional way would be to use a pipe and to basically burn most of it.
Right.
And now people are moving on to using modified vapor,
vape
dab
pens.
rigs and vape pens and that kind of thing. And this is all wonderful. This is thinking about and testing, experimenting on oneself, of more effective, safer, more efficient, healthier ways of consuming this remarkable molecule. And and it's not just the kind of extraction and ingestion either. I mean, you look back to Alexander Shulgin, Sasha Shulgin, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of his work. I mean,
P-Cal, T-Cal.
P-Cal and T-Cal. There you go. So the world owes Shulgin an enormous debt.
Jacques Lemaire.
Right. So
yeah.
you've got these people that are. I mean, Shulgin in particular, manufacturing, inventing, creating these molecules that simply didn't exist at all, brand new molecules, and trying them all on himself and his small research group, and assaying, biological assays, determining what are the effects, what are the dose levels, how long do they last, are they good for this or for that. One can read P-Cal now and realize what an incredible kind of compendium of brand new psychedelic molecules he's offered to the world. And yes, maybe only a handful are in wide use, but they're very, very important ones. MDMA, MDA, 2CB, 2CT7. These are widely used now and could, in the future, be as important as the natural psychedelics like psilocybin or DMT in therapeutic contexts. So certainly everything that's been going on, even during the prohibition decades, which feels like we're kind of moving towards the end of now. Mm-hmm. All of this work was going on behind the scenes, and certainly any company that is getting into this kind of stumbled on psychedelics in the last few years certainly owes a large debt to that whole thriving community on the internet and off the internet that's been working with these molecules for decades now.
I mean, we actually even got into the stuff through we're big Grateful Dead fans. The Grateful Dead came up with their name from smoking DMT, and that was in the late 60s. So I mean, this is obviously, and they had Owsley and all these amazing chemists and other people that were aware of all these compounds and stuff around them. But yeah, I mean, we were reading Erwid in the late 90s in high school, what about this one? What about that one? And
right when that thing was getting going.
Yeah, and then we were kind of the weirdos back then. Nobody was really talking about. There wasn't any internet. We knew a handful of people that were kind of into this stuff, and it was always this counterculture thing in a way. When you look at this is what I wanted to discuss. Actually, we were going back and forth. You posted something about salvinorin B methoxy ether and this extended salvinorin or salvia trip. Can you give us a little bit of, not maybe paint a picture, but just give us an idea of what that experience might entail?
Yeah, so everyone, most people are aware of salvia, of course, Salvia divinorum. So Salvia divinorum, this Mexican herb, what was actually until recently was a very rare Mexican herb that only grew in these isolated mountains in southern Mexico. Mm-hmm. But I
think Oaxaca is where, maybe if I'm mistaken. think it's
So
Walta.
what was that?
I said I think it's Walta, or near where Maria Sabina, that whole region. I
Right.
think that's where it's really only found, in the mountain regions over there.
Yeah, exactly. So Salvia divinorum was kind of discovered by the West by Gordon Wasson, who is a huge figure in the kind of ethnobotany field. He first tried it and didn't really get much of an effect from it. He had to kind of chew down a couple of dozen of these large leaves, very, very bitter and astringent. And he saw some mild effects, geometric shapes, but he wasn't particularly impressed. And he if you read his original paper, he says, perhaps a higher dose would elicit some stronger effects. And of course, a couple of decades after that, when salvinorin was actually isolated and was originally taken, the isolated molecule, the active constituent salvinorin A was the first one, was taken by an independent researcher called Daniel Siebert, who's still around, and he extracted a very kind of crude extract that turned out to be about 80% pure salvinorin A, and he did a bit of a Hoffman, and he said, okay, I'm just going to take a small amount, and he took I think was like 2 or 3 milligrams, which turned out to be like 2 solid milligrams of salvinorin A, which is a very powerful dose, and it literally tore his reality apart. And the very first thing he said, he wrote down in big capital letters when he came back, was that this is absolute. What did he say?
Is that the guy from Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, when he did the episode on it? He went to some guy's house who just by chance extracted this thing, I think, I don't know, in like the 80s or something.
It could be, yeah. He wrote, "It is total madness tearing apart the fabric of reality." So this was 1993. So then, he was obviously psychologically and ontologically shattered to his very core. But he was also obviously delighted that he had discovered this molecule. And then, of course, the scientists came in and started to try and work out what actually was going on with this molecule. Because salvinorin is an entirely unexpected psychedelic, both in terms of its structure and its the way that it works in the brain. So the other kind of what we call the classic psychedelics, so psilocybin, DMT, LSD, mescaline, these are all alkaloids, which are naturally occurring nitrogen-based molecules, or nitrogen-containing carbon-based molecules that are actually built from amino acids inside the plant. Whereas salvinorin belongs to a completely different class of molecules called the terpenes, and which are made by a completely different mechanism. So then, if you were looking, if you were analyzing plants to try and find psychedelic molecules, you wouldn't be looking for salvinorin. It's a completely different chemical class. So that's the first thing that's kind of surprising about salvinorin when it was first discovered. Secondly, is its mechanism of action. The classic psychedelics, as many people will know, they bind and activate a particular subtype of serotonin receptor in the brain, which is responsible for the psychedelic effects. Whereas salvinorin does not.
It's kappa opioid, right?
Exactly. So it binds to this unusual. Now, most people know the opioids. Obviously, like the opium poppy, for example, morphine is an opiate, right. And it binds to a different class of opioid receptor, but that are completely unrelated to the kappa opioid. And so the kappa opioid receptor is activated by salvinorin. And so the mechanism by which salvinorin has its psychedelic effects is completely different to the classic psychedelics. Salvinorin, or the kappa opioid receptors, are found in quite a small or they have a very, very high concentration in a very small area of the cortex, or underneath the cortex, called the Clostrum, which is, the Clostrum it's the most heavily interconnected with the cortex part of the brain. So it's very small, but it connects very, very, very densely to all areas of the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, which is kind of responsible for constructing your world model.
We're getting a little buzz here. I don't know what that is.
It's gone.
Is that you, Maurice?
No.
Better not be.
Are we okay?
Yeah, I think we're good now. Sorry.
Yeah. So the Clostrum, this small area of the brain, heavily interconnected with the cortex, and its role is, it's still, I mean, you can go to conferences. They still have conferences, understanding the Clostrum. So it's, despite being a very small area, structure within the brain, or relatively small anyway, its true function, or all of its functions are not fully understood. It's still an active area of research. But what it seems to do is it seems to have kind of two broad effects. One thing that it does is it has this broad inhibitory effect on the cortex. So it's like a global inhibitor. It holds back the activity of all of the neurons in the cortex and basically stops them getting kind of overactive. It also controls. It also kind of controls the signal to noise ratio of the cortex. So the world that you experience is a model. It's a model of the environment that your brain constructs, and your brain basically moves from state to state as it's kind of building the world that you experience. And so your experience of the world around you is this dynamic movement of your cortex from state to state over time, and that is kind of controlled to a large extent, or partially at least, by the Clostrum. So what the Clostrum is doing is it's trying to find the signal patterns of activity, the kind of these synchronized and coherent patterns of activity which represent your kind of world model, and it amplifies those. And then it also looks for noisy and unsynchronized patterns or weak patterns of activity, and it suppresses them. So it acts to kind of increase the signal noise ratio. It also controls the movement of the brain from state to state. So your brain has to not only represent the structure of your world, but it also has to be able to move. Obviously your world is dynamic. Everything's going on in the environment all the time. So your brain must be able to move from state to state, sort of glide, if you like, from state to state. And the Clostrum seems to help in that regard, in that it kind of shuts down one state and allows another state to, it's like a peaceful transference of power, which is a term that you Americans will be familiar with in recent times, right? So that's the idea. The Clostrum it's orchestrating. People often describe the Clostrum as an orchestrator of the cortex. It's like the orchestra of an orchestra. The conductor of an orchestra is the way you kind of think about it. And it's controlling the level of activity, but it's also controlling the structure of the activity and the way that this activity flows through time. And so what these kappa opioid receptors do, getting back to salvinorin, is that they shut down the Clostrum. They're inhibitory. So when salvinorin gets into your brain, it binds to these kappa opioid receptors in your Clostrum, and basically it shuts off the Clostrum, or shuts it down to some extent, quietens the activity of the Clostrum. And so the Clostrum basically loses control of the cortex. It's no longer controlling the level of activity. So you get this global, it's called disinhibition of cortical activity. So all the neurons become more active, and at the same time, the cortex loses its conductor from state to state. So it's kind of like, imagine you've got an orchestra and it's being conducted and they're playing some very complex symphony, some Shostakovich number. And imagine you go up to the conductor whilst this piece is in mid-flow, this symphony, and you put a gun to the conductor's head and say, okay, I want you to make them play the piece faster and faster. And then you shoot the conductor in the head.
Sounds
right?
like Phil Spector or something.
Right? You can imagine, you force this orchestra to play faster and faster, and then you get rid of the conductor. And then you can imagine what happens. And so you've got this, it's like a two-pronged effect. You're increasing the activity of the cortex by releasing that control that the Clostrum has, and also removing that movement, that controlled movement from state to state. And so you're basically releasing the cortex in a way and allowing entirely new emergent patterns of activity to emerge. And for reasons that we don't really understand, when the cortex loses that control, when you release the cortex from that claustral control, you get these very, very strange patterns of activity that emerge, and these are experienced as these bizarre, extremely bizarre, kind of reality-shattering salvia worlds, when your reality is literally torn apart and you're kind of twisted through this extremely bizarre and strange and ever-changing reality space. And that's why I think Salvinorin is so potent, is because it is, it's not like the classic psychedelics, which are kind of, they work in one primary way, which is to stimulate certain neurons, certain nerves, brain cells, basically, and increasing the activity. Whereas Salvinorin is kind of releasing the cortex and allowing the cortex to kind of do its own thing without any constraints. And so that completely, your entire reality basically falls apart and reconfigures and contorts and into some very, very strange shapes and places, which is remarkable.
Yeah, I've smoked it when I was a lot younger, and probably a handful of times. I think it was like 32x, and yeah, it's definitely out there.
All right.
You better be sitting down, and you better have some. All right, folks. Sorry we got cut out there, but we're back. Andrew was just about to explain the Salvinorin B methoxy ether experience to it. Let's get in here.
Yeah. So Salvinorin A, which is the first salvinorin to be discovered, and this extremely potent molecule, as I said, it binds to this kappa opioid receptor, and that's what's responsible for its activity and for its effects. But fortunately, it seems it's almost as if nature kind of understands the power of these molecules. DMT, for example, only lasts for a few minutes, and you can hardly imagine it lasting any longer. Whereas psilocybin, which is more manageable, lasts for hours, and it's almost as if it's programmed into it. And Salvinorin also, whilst being completely reality shattering, generally only lasts for a few minutes. Mercifully for most people, but this doesn't stop pharmacologists, the medicinal chemists, trying to modify the molecule. So if you've got a molecule works, or psychedelic molecules work they bind to the receptor, and their structure determines how they bind to the receptor and how they activate the receptor, and how long they stay on the receptor. So how sticky are they? What is their affinity? How strongly do they bind to the receptor, and how long do they stay there? So LSD, for example, binds to the 5-HT2A receptor very, very strongly, and kind of
Is that the longest one? From my experience,
yes,
it seems like it's the
exactly.
longest.
So LSD is kind of fascinating. It sits in the receptor and it actually distorts the receptor and kind of pulls a part of the receptor over itself. They call it a lid. I mean, it's not really a lid, but just a part of the receptor protein that kind of folds over,
sure,
and locks that LSD into the pocket, and so it doesn't come out, and it's completely inaccessible to metabolic enzymes. So that's why LSD is so potent and lasts for 8 to 12 hours or so, depending on dose. salvinorin, when it binds to the kappa opioid receptor, doesn't stick around that long, fortunately, which is why the effects are extremely powerful, but only last for a few minutes. But what you can often do with molecules, once you understand to some degree how they're binding to the receptor, what are the interactions between the molecule and the receptor that are important, that allow it to stick in the receptor and cause this particular activation change in the receptor. Once you understand that, you can attempt to actually modify that molecule and say, okay, maybe if we add a particular group, a particular chemical group to the molecule, we can make it stick more. And these are analogs. These are semi-synthetic analogs of salvinorin. And there's one in particular called, as you said, methoxymethyl salvinorin B, which is basically salvinorin B that has this extra group attached to it. And it turns out that when you add this particular group, this methoxymethyl group to it, it causes the salvinorin B to bind much more strongly to the receptor and to stay there for longer. And this increases the potency, first of all, of salvinorin B. So it's about 3 times more potent. In other words, you need 3 times less of the molecule. So instead of a couple of milligrams, you need less than a milligram. So the dosage is obviously different. But also, because it sticks on the receptor for longer, it lasts, instead of lasting a few minutes, it lasts for 2 to 3 hours. Which for me just sounds like a horrendous idea, to be held within the Salvia space with that level of reality destruction for any longer than 2 or 3 minutes. To me is outrageous, and I guess it's a good example of just because you can do it doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
And that definitely applies here. As far it's a good example of pharmacoengineering, of medicinal chemistry, where you can demonstrate that you understand what's going on with this molecule at the receptor level, such that you can actually modulate its affinity and the way that it binds the receptor. But that doesn't mean that it should be used in humans. And generally, trip reports with this salvinorin B analog, this methoxymethyl salvinorin B, are scant. I think I've only read one online that somebody had published, and it sounds horrific. It lasted 3 hours, and they were taken. They experienced a whole other life in some city that they'd never been to. Like literally from childhood onwards. So they completely. When they weren't just taken to another world as such, they were actually taken to a completely other existence and a completely other life. And then they kind of snapped back and realized that 3 hours had gone. And you can imagine that this is perhaps quite difficult to integrate. And I guess when you ingest a psychedelic molecule, you are playing with this very delicate, tightly organized system that is the brain, and you need to be respectful and be careful of what you're doing. I mean, psychedelics are very safe, largely, but there is the potential for kind of psychedelic disintegration and for some ontologically shattering experiences that might be difficult to deal with. So I don't recommend anyone tries to source this methoxymethyl salvinorin B. I just think it's too much for any sane human being, or any human being that wants to remain sane.
Yeah.
Well, good advice, I think.
And so just to point out, most traditional psychedelics play off the 5-HT2A receptors, Salvia, kappa opioid. I just recently read a paper, I think it was a study done by Roland Griffiths and maybe Matthew Johnson, where they were talking about how the default mode network might not be associated with psychedelics like they once thought, since the kappa opioid receptor, the kappa opioid, had this dramatic effect in the study they did with Salvia. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there's actually a recent study with Salvia that I think it was an fMRI study. It might have been an EEG. I think it was an fMRI study. We actually observe this destruction, or not destruction, this kind of dismantling or disintegration of the default mode network with Salvia as well. So I mean, so when we think again, go back to what I was saying about the role of the Clostrum in organizing and controlling cortical activity. The default mode network is a set of cortical areas. It's a set of areas in the cortex that tend to be active under certain conditions. In the resting state, when you're in perhaps a closed eye state, when you're not really focused on any particular task or activity in the outside world, but are perhaps daydreaming or reminiscing or thinking about who you might marry or that kind of thing. This is when the default mode network is tends to be most active. So it doesn't surprise me when you release control of the Clostrum on the cortex that you will actually affect not just the kind of the structure of your world, but also the facilities controlled by the DMN, the default mode network, including the sense of self as well. I mean, it's thought that the DMN is very important for kind of delineating the self versus the environment, maintaining the sense of an agent acting within a world. There's me thinking about myself and things going on in my head, and then there's everything going on in the environment. Now, of course, they are both of these models, if you like. You can imagine it like you've got a world model, a model of the outside world, which you navigate and you perform actions within, and then you've got this kind of self model, which is the model of yourself interacting with that environment. They're both built by the brain, but they're kept separate. They're differentiated. And that helps you maintain a sense of ego, a sense of someone who is distinct from the environment. And what psychedelics do, and certainly high doses of LSD and psilocybin, is by this differentiation between these networks that control different parts of this self-world model tend to blur, and you get the kind of a blurring of the boundaries between the self and the outside world. And this is when you get these ego death at high doses, or oceanic boundlessness, a sense of merging and becoming one with all of reality. That likely happens when the default mode network is disrupted along with the world model, and so the brain loses that differentiation between the self and the world. And so with Salvia, you're seeing that to an extreme level, where people will often, particularly with high doses of salvinorin, will not only lose their sense of self, but will lose any memory of ever being a human or ever being anything. And there's a kind of horrifying, what I describe as like an existential absoluteness of the Salvia space, in that when you're in there, it's the only reality that has ever existed or could ever exist. And there's it's an extremely compelling, undeniable feeling that this is not only the true reality, but the only reality that has ever existed, and that your entire life as a human being is some kind of sideshow, and a show that just ended, basically. So that's why I think Salvia is not something to be played with, certainly at the higher doses, because it will cause this sense of what's often called ontological shock, where your entire concept of reality is completely, all of your ontological foundations of what is and isn't true, and who you are and aren't, are completely torn apart, and you're left completely, you lose all moorings with your normal waking reality, and are thrust into this completely alien space, from which there is no escape for eternity. That's the sense here, and you can understand that could be horrifying, to say the least. So yeah, it's not. I wince a little bit when you don't see him so much anymore, but these YouTube videos, like these huge fucking bongs, like 100 times, man.
You got to get those hits, man.
Yeah.
You got to get those hits.
Yeah, there's a guy, Hamilton on Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia interviewed that famous YouTube guy that he's like, now it's time to do some gardening. And he pulls out a bong and smokes it, and he doesn't do any gardening. He just sits there tripping out. But yeah, and then you have those scary videos where the people like jumping through windows and off the couch. And so, yeah, I mean, there is crazy stuff out there. I will say that when I did it, very repeaty, very fractally, not just in the visual sense, but in like almost like robot world in a way.
Yeah.
And also, like you better be sitting down in a very controlled environment too, because, you know, things could get crazy. That's not one that I usually recommend to people. But so looking at this Salvia experience, I've also been looking into other alkaloids. Obviously, you have phenethylamines, you have tropanes, you have all these different, subgroups. Why do you think tropanes are not enjoyable when you look at like trip reports or people's personal experiences with datura or stuff like that? Like, why do you think it's one of those where it's like people don't really have that much good stuff to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, so tropanes, they have a completely different mechanism of action to the classic psychedelics. Most people are uncomfortable even calling tropanes. So when we talk about tropanes, what we're talking about are scopolamine is the main one, or hyoscine, it's also called, atropine, and they occur in what are often referred to as the old world psychedelics. So mandrake, what else is there? Deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, as well as in sort of new world plants like datura or brugmansia. So these are plants that contain these alkaloids called tropanes, scopolamine being the main kind of psychoactive one. The problem with the tropanes, first of all, aside from their psychological effects, is that they have other physiological effects. So they affect the heart and they affect the respiratory system, and so they're dangerous. They can, unlike psilocybin, for example, you can take too much psilocybin, you might have a wild experience.
Yeah, but it's rated as one of the safest ones on that chart, right?
Exactly, right. But it's not going to harm you physiologically, almost certainly not. You might have a heart attack or a stroke or something if it becomes psychologically distressing.
Yeah.
But it's not inherently harmful. The tropanes are different. So first of all, there's an actual physical risk with them. That's the first thing. But in terms of their psychological effects, they're often called deliriants, in that they turn you temporarily insane, one could say, and they tend to elicit what are often called true hallucinations. Right? Remember the Terence McKenna book, True Hallucinations?
Sure.
So that term, true hallucinations. So when people think about hallucinations, with respect to the classic psychedelics, so LSD or whatever, they're really talking about what I would prefer to call open eye or closed eye visuals. So these are changes in your perception that are easily identifiable as changes in your perception. So
usually of stuff that's already there, though, like the floor, like the hardwood floor, you can see more lines, or the carpet looks fluffier, or the walls moving patterns, kind of a thing.
Exactly. Yep. So you get these changes in the structure and dynamics of the world, and sometimes objects will change into other objects. So you might. So in Sasha Shulgin's book, Pikal, he describes a mescaline experience where he's looking at the driveway and there are all these pebbles and they turn into this bed of gleaming jewels, and then it starts to move and it becomes the back of this huge serpent, like a huge snake. So you get changes but clearly you generally maintain insight. You realize that you're under the influence of a drug, and you realize that these are not normal experiences. Now, with the tropanes, they are a different beast. What they tend to do is they tend to elicit, as I said, what are called true hallucinations, which are generally hallucinations that are indistinguishable from the environment. So, for example, you walk into the kitchen and your two friends who you haven't seen in a while are sat there, and you start having a conversation with them, and you you make them some tea and you cook some food for them, and then you turn around and they're not there, and they never were there. And people will, and this can happen for an extended period of time. You might find yourself in an airport, complete with bustling crowds and things, and be perfectly convinced that that's where you are, and forget that you've ever taken a drug. And then you turn your head and you're back in the room, and you have a moment of clarity, and then it all starts again. And one of the most common things is what are called phantom cigarettes, which is a very common experience where people will smoke an invisible cigarette for a long period of time.
On tropanes?
On tropanes.
Oh.
And then they notice the cigarette isn't there, and they scramble around on the floor looking for it because they think they've dropped it and they're going to set the house on fire. That's how convinced they are. And you can imagine when you lose insight into the hallucinations, when the hallucinations seem absolutely real, indistinguishable from your normal waking world, but are completely different, you can understand that it's like being in a waking dream, certainly at kind of moderate doses. In your waking dream, you're kind of normally, in most dreams anyway, you're kind of in the normal world, but things are happening, of course. But your muscles, of course, are suppressed. You don't act out your dreams unless you have some very rare neurological conditions. But you can imagine if you were in a dream and your muscles weren't inhibited and you started acting out, how dangerous that would be. And this kind of thing can happen with the tropanes, is where you find yourself in this what is really a complete fantasy world, but is completely indistinguishable from reality, and you can act it out. And anyone who's trying to kind of help you or aid you or stop you will often be met with resistance, so to speak. And people can become outright violent in a tropane state because they're completely convinced that what they're doing makes perfect sense. They're trying to escape that fucking tiger that's running into the house. And
do they know? So what's the mechanism then that in the brain? Do they know? Do they know what's going on and why that's so different?
Yeah, so basically, in simple terms, so as I said before, your world is a model of the environment. It's your brain's kind of best guess about what's going on out there. Your brain builds this subjective reality, this simulational space in a way, that allows you to navigate and make sense of and perform actions, run away from predators, chase prey, chase mates, whatever, in the environment. But your brain never really has access to the environment. It's never direct access. It relies upon noisy patterns of sensory information to inform its model. But the world you experience, your phenomenal world, is always this model, but it's always being kind of tested against sensory information. So you have this model. Your brain is basically using the model that you're experiencing to try and predict the patterns of sensory information that it is going to receive in the next moment. And that is how your brain kind of tests its model, is by saying, if I think this is happening, this should happen next, and if my model is working. And so there's always this balance between the brain trusting its model. If the brain thinks it understands what's going on out there, then it can trust its model. But it always needs to test it against sensory information. But it needs to strike a balance between trusting its model and trusting sensory information. So for example, if you're under, let's say, low light conditions, if you're walking down a dark alley at night, your brain could turn any play of light or shadows into some horrific predator that's going to kill you, some night stalker or something. Right. But it doesn't. It realizes that actually in low light conditions, the sensory information isn't that good. So I can rely more on the model that I've got. And actually, the model is probably perfectly okay, and it's probably a completely empty dark alley, and this is just plays of light and shadows. So your brain was always trying to strike that balance between trusting its its model and trusting the sensory information. And what your brain is able to do is, depending on the conditions, it's able to kind of turn up or down the level of sensory information it's receiving. If it thinks the sensory information is crap, nonsense, it's not very good, unreliable, it can kind of turn the volume down, if you like, on sensory information and rely more on its model. You don't notice that, by the way. That's just something the brain is doing all the time. What the tropanes do is they bind to a type of acetylcholine receptor called the muscarine 1 receptor, or the M1 receptor. And what that does is it shuts down, it blocks that receptor, and it mimics a state where the brain, it mimics the kind of state where the brain feels like it can't trust any sensory information. So it has to rely 100% on its model. So even though you can still see the world around you, your brain doesn't trust anything. Or trust very, very little of the actual information going into your brain. So if you think for a moment, you get the idea that you've just lit a cigarette, your brain creates the experience of you. It incorporates that cigarette into your world model. Now, normally, of course, if you thought, have I just lit a cigarette? No, I haven't lit a cigarette. I don't have a cigarette. Because your brain is relying on the sensory information. There's no cigarette in between my fingers. I don't feel it.
I've seen drunk people do that a few times as well.
Right. Yeah. So
Yes,
so normally your brain knows very quickly whether something is wrong, whether some kind of idea or some kind of some version of its model is incorrect, because it uses sensory information to sort of say, the model is not correct.
Right.
There's no cigarette. But in the tropane state, that, because the sensory information is essentially blocked off by the tropane alkaloids, scopolamine or whatever, these ideas can become ingrained. They become part of your world model, and your brain never corrects them. So you have the idea that you've lit a cigarette. That cigarette becomes part of your world model, and it's never corrected. And so you can go on smoking this phantom cigarette, which is completely there for you. That's the pertinent point. The cigarette is there in your world. It's just not there to anybody else looking at you. You're smoking a cigarette. You can see the cigarette. You can see the smoke coming out, everything that you would expect. Imagine you were smoking in a dream. That's what it would be like, but you're not in a dream. And so what it takes is for a moment of focused attention, and the brain temporarily can kind of turn up the volume on these sensory signals and go, there's no cigarette there. But then you kind of lose that focus again momentarily, and then you realize, where's the fucking cigarette gone? And then you're on the floor trying to find it again. And so it's like a dream, in that your brain, in the dream state, of course, you're navigating a world that's disconnected from the environment. Your brain shuts off completely sensory information from the environment. Now imagine that sort of halfway between the normal waking state, in which you've got full access to sensory information, and the dream state, where you've got no access to sensory information. So imagine just turning the sensory information down. That's the tropane state. And so you can still, most of the time, you can navigate the world, but you're losing a lot of those clues, a lot of that information the brain relies upon to keep you sane, to keep its model functioning, to keep its model mapped to actually what's going on in the environment. So any strange models can become ingrained and become established within your overall phenomenal world, and they're not tested for, it could be minutes, it could be longer, and it will depend upon the dose as well. And so, in some cases, you can find yourself in completely fantastical worlds for a long period of time, and you can act out as if you were there and have no idea of what you're actually doing in the environment, which could obviously be extremely dangerous, particularly if you live on a high floor or something.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. And actually, I kind of have an idea now. Before, I was just trying to, because I've never experienced datura, is cocaine tropane? I think it might have some.
It's related. I mean, it's slightly.
Yeah, I guess maybe back in the day, maybe something like that. But yeah, I've never experienced any of these datura or like you mentioned, Nightshade or any of those. So they're
Yeah.
pretty unusual. I know some people that have done it, but it's not that common.
No, I think it's really it's the intrepid fringes of the psychedelic subculture that would be interested in it. I mean, it lasts a long time. It's for most people, it's not particularly worthwhile as a psychedelic. As I say, it's more of a delirium. It's more likely that you will end up in a kind of a waking dream state than you would actually end up in kind of any interesting other phenomenal reality.
Yeah, who do we had? We had Matthew Palomari on, and he was discussing how one of his friends was clearing out his garden, and he had all tons of datura, and he didn't know, and he was getting all the juices from the roots on his hands, and supposedly he was having some pretty crazy experiences.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of kind of case studies of people eating the berries of deadly nightshade and making pies from them.
Yeah.
And then being found by the police several hours later, running around the house naked, covered in purple vomit.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it ends well for anybody on that front.
Yeah.
It's a nursery rhyme gone horribly wrong.
So before we wrap it up and jump to a Patreon segment, I do want to ask you about the extended stay stuff, where it's at, any new developments with the extended DMT. Is there... I saw maybe an article where they said they were putting it on hold because of everything that's going on. But is there, has there been any breakthroughs with that, or?
I wouldn't say breakthroughs. I think So the who is it? Medicinal Mindfulness, the group out of Boulder, Colorado. I think they put everything on hold because of COVID. And they obviously can't have the big meetups and with the team that they're trying to put together.
Right.
To actually implement this, so that's on hold. The Imperial team, I hear whispers that they're beginning the early stages of trying to use this infusion technology. What kind of experiments they are going to be doing, I don't think that's 100% clear. At least not to me yet. Whether it will be for purely I guess sort of neuroscientific experiments or neuroimaging kind of things where they're looking at brain activity in fMRI or EEG or MEG or whatever, or whether they're actually they're going to be more interested in the actual phenomenology of the state and keeping someone in the DMT space to actually. I mean, that's obviously been my vision, is that this would be used as a way of navigating and keeping someone within the space and hopefully stabilizing them within the space such that they can perform experiments to establish communication with any intelligences within in the space. But I think we're a bit of a way off before we reach that stage. Now, the paper that I wrote with Rick Strassman way back, almost 5 years now, I think, that was a kind of preliminary proof of principle pharmacokinetic model. But I've been working with a team in Sweden who's about to, I think, received a rough draft of a new paper. They've done a much more detailed analysis of Rick's original DMT blood data, and they've done a much more sophisticated model, pharmacokinetic model, performed by specialists, specialist pharmacokineticists, which I am not, and neither is Rick. And so hopefully that will inform the actual research going into humans with using this extended state. It's not that simple. It's not simply a case of plugging someone into a DMT machine or injecting them with a continuous infusion. Has to be controlled to maintain a reasonable concentration of DMT in the brain within a reasonable window.
Yeah, where do they get the compounds that they use in these studies? Does somebody synthesize them? Because I know, on your thing, you're a computational neurobiologist, pharmacologist, chemist. Obviously, do they have the same people that are doing, if they're in chemistry, do they make the compounds, or does somebody else separately make them, or how does that work?
They would normally outsource, so they would get. So I think. So, for example, when Rick Strassman did all the studies in the 90s, but he got Dave Nichols, the the great Dave Nichols at Purdue to actually synthesize. So his lab synthesized the DMT. And yeah, I mean, generally the people that do the fMRI work won't be chemists,
right?
But they would have a relationship with some organic chemistry lab that would synthesize and purify and assay. I mean, it's not simply a case of, I mean, anyone can make DMT in the lab if you've got access to a organic chemistry lab, but to produce pharmaceutical grade DMT that you can assay properly and inject into humans for extended periods of time, this has to be, I guess this has to be 99.9% pure.
Is it always injected, or is it ever smoked?
In some studies, I think people will be, for that reason, basically. I mean, it's much safer to give someone smoked DMT if you don't have the capability of producing this pharmaceutical grade than it is to inject it. So certainly people that are extracting from Mimosa hostilis root bark in their kitchens shouldn't be injecting it. They certainly shouldn't be injecting it into anybody else. I mean, you have to go through a proper process of chromatographic separation and purification and proper assaying of level of purity and properly prepared for injection, formation of the correct salt and water-soluble salt, and then does
that smell like plastic too, even at its purest medicinal form?
The free base tends to have a stronger smell, but yeah, these salts tend to be milder. But certainly when you're injecting for clinical studies, it would be in a sealed vial with a certain concentration, and you would draw it out into the syringe. And that will go straight into there. So no one would ever get their nose to it.
Yeah. Since we've had you on last, we've had Rick Strassman on, and we've obviously talked about some of these things. And yeah, I mean, when we started the podcast, it's like, there's a handful of people, and he was definitely one of them. And through him, we learned about you and, your work. How do you communicate with other, psychedelics or people in the psychedelic realm and science? Do you speak with Rick regularly or other scientists? Is that something you do, or is that something that happens, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I do occasionally, but I'm very much an individual. I tend to work best on my own. And, I consult. I offer my advice to people. What I try and avoid doing is I don't attach myself too strongly to any particular project. I'm an ideas man. I'm that kind of guy, I'm the ideas man.
Yeah, that's why this is called visionary psychedelic scientist or science. That's because I mean, look, I think we need more of that. We had Avi Loeb on earlier talking about how his idea of like a Oumuamua, this interstellar object being possibly extraterrestrial origin. We need more of those type of outside the box thinkers, because science is kind of at a standstill, especially if you look at like physics, and there's no unified theory, and you have the quantum, physicists and the, classical physicists, and they're just kind of at odds. But within the psychedelic realm, it seems like there's some sort of synergy. It seems like everybody's kind of on the same page, like let's respect, the indigenous stuff. Let's carve out this new space where we can learn about these and actually the mechanisms behind them and how they interact and what we can do. Because obviously there's a lot of people suffering out there with mental illness. So, it seems to be like everybody's on the same page. You might get a couple of Scrooges here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty cool. Yeah,
I think so. And I try and stay within both worlds, or act as a mediator, if you like, between the very scientific world and those, as I said before, who are more on the fringes, and try and say, can we find common ground really between those ways of thinking, and try and keep an open mind, and realize that we know so very, very little about what these, what the DMT experience or what the Salvia experience really means. There is limited we can understand by looking at brain activity. There's a lot we can learn from looking at brain activity, and looking at drug receptor interactions and that kind of thing. But there comes a time when we must confront the experience itself, and And that's what I try and do, is not neglect the experience. If you go back to the 1950s, when I did an interview with Stephen Zara, who was the guy that first discovered DMT as the active principle of these indigenous hallucinogenic snuffs, like cahoba. And he, when they first did their studies, they would inject people with DMT, and they would write the paper, and they would just say, hallucinations,
right.
Complex hallucinations. And we had some difficulty with Dave Luke at Greenwich University in London. We had some difficulty in trying to get to the experiences of these people back in these earliest eras, because they simply didn't record them, or they certainly didn't publish them. And if they did record them, those documents are long gone. So you've got this paper about this brand new psychedelic, extremely powerful psychedelic molecule, and you've got maybe two case, brief snippets of two subjects' experiences, right. and then that's all you've got. It's like, they injected 30 or 40 people, and if only they'd done a Rick Strassman. I mean, Rick Strassman did the right thing in that the experiences took center stage in his studies. And that's really important, I think, is that when you're doing these studies, you don't just think about what are the change in brain activity.
It was a smart play, actually, tell them you're going to do trivial stuff and come out with the hard data.
Yeah, you have to be as boring as possible, I think.
When you're pitching it, right? And then you can come out with
when you're pitching it.
Yeah.
As he did.
You got to play the game, baby.
Somebody wanted to ask, if you were to try any of these new experiments, is there one that you would try personally, or you think that might have some sort of visionary experience effect?
Which one of the new what?
Out of like any of the psychedelic experience, like assume that you're not, a scientist administering these things. Assume that you're just a participant. Is there a study that you think's interesting or intrigues you that you would try if you weren't, on the other end of things?
Well, I think for me, in terms of the kind of the phenomenology, and if you want to experience something dramatic and astonishing, then I think the extended DMT state experiments, they're going to be the way to go. With psilocybin and LSD, it tends to be a bolus dose. So you're given the drug with a single injection, or often just a capsule, and then you wait for the effects. And so you're having really a normal psychedelic experience that anyone can have, really. If you can source some magic mushrooms or grow some magic mushrooms, then you can have that experience. But extended state DMT is a completely different kettle of fish, so to speak, in that it's very difficult or impossible, I think, or very difficult for somebody who doesn't have access to those kind of facilities to actually. In the future it will be possible, I think, but at the moment you'd have to take part in one of these studies to actually have one of these hour-long breakthrough DMT experiences. Whether I'd be up for it, I'm not sure. But yeah, if you're into that, if you really like to stay in the space. But there are things that people can do. There are people now. Again, it's all underground. But
what about extended like psilocybin? And let me say this: I think that the experience psilocybin, obviously it lasts a long time, depending on how much you take. 3 to 6 hours.
Yeah.
Now, for somebody like me who has OCD, that might be a nice reset, allows the CBT therapy, the therapy to kind of take hold a little bit better, that kind of stuff. But is there any evidence to show there's more neuroplasticity the longer these experiences go on? Because if that's the case, if you could stay in one of these states, maybe you could, rewire things permanently, or at least kind of give yourself a little bit of a blank slate.
I don't think it's really known. In terms of neuroplasticity, I don't know. I think the neuroplasticity effect seems to be something that occurs after. It's not something that's going on as much during the experience. What you're happening during the experience is a loosening up, kind of a plasticization, if you like, of the cortex, and allowing the cortex to find healthier states if you're depressed and you're in a very kind of, you have these very ingrained negative patterns of activity, which are expressed as negative thought patterns and pessimism and all that kind of stuff. Psychedelics allow you to kind of dismantle those patterns and allow more positive and adaptive.
I think of them as like embedded thought loops. I don't necessarily think of it as chemical imbalances or anything like that.
Well, no, it's not a chemical imbalance, but yeah, these are these patterns of thought are caused by or are correlated with ingrained patterns of cortical activity. There is that relationship, and so when you shake up the cortex and allow it to explore new states, you're allowing, with the guidance of the clinician, of the counsellor, to actually find better ways of thinking. It's much like malleable. Whereas you might take years of psychotherapy to try and break out of these old patterns and find new ones. Here, you kind of you've plasticized the cortex.
It's amazing. So, I think it's not just somebody who's asking about how Rick kind of disagrees that these are a panacea of a cure-all in a way. And I think that that's true to a certain extent from my own experience, because I see a lot of people that take psychedelics that are on psychedelic forums that are still egomaniacs or assholes or whatever the case may be. So I don't think that this is like this is not like a silver bullet or just some sort of, take one pill solution. I do think though, if you're a thinker, a lot about yourself, maybe you meditate, maybe you're very introspective, I think these then can be super helpful because you kind of already have these tools to work with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's all about what's your intention and what kind of guidance are you going to get during the trip. What are you aiming to do? If you're just aiming to find out the secrets of the universe or something, you might get some insights, but that's not necessarily going to disrupt. If it's not direct, if you're not trying to direct the experience towards finding some deep-seated issues that you've got that's causing, depression or anxiety or whatever, then that's not necessarily going to happen. It has to be guided. You plasticize the brain and make it more fluid, but then you have to kind of mold it into the right shape, so to speak.
I have found that looking back on psychedelics, like during like a psilocybin experience, that things come up that I would never have thought about, like growing up. How, I remember how I perceived these things, and that helped me understand myself a little bit more that I would have never thought about. So, there's obviously something going on, though, where you are connected to more of your own self or your brain, where you can then kind of rework out, like you said, like get to some of these deeper issues. So it is something, I don't think it is a cure-all, but again, if you're a thinker and you understand yourself and maybe you know a lot about the disorder you have, I think these can be very, very powerful tools.
Precisely, yeah. We're agreed on that.
All right. Well, let's wrap up here and then move on to our Patreon here. So again, go check out Andrew's website. I have the link down below. You said you're working on a new book. Do you want to maybe give us, do you have a title or a working title or?
So the book is about, in my last book, I focused on DMT, and this book is going to be really, I'm going to look at all classes of psychedelics. So the classic psychedelics, ketamine, and the PCP, that class, the NMDA antagonists, the tropanes, Salvia, and bring them all together and explain how they work in terms of the way that they affect. I just described in this talk, the way that these molecules affect your reality. They affect your world, your model of the world that you experience, your phenomenal world. And so what we can do is think about kind of a world space, if you like, a space of all possible states of the cortex, which is basically a space of all possible worlds, and think of psychedelics as offering ways to access different regions within that world space by different mechanisms, but basically ultimately they're all unified by changing the structure of your world. And so the idea of the book will be to bring together all the psychedelics and talk about how how, first of all, talk about how your brain constructs your normal waking phenomenal world, what we call consensus world, and then talk about how each of the different classes of psychedelics manipulate the brain from the receptor level upwards and cause changes in the structure of neural activity, and how that relates to the structure of your world, and how that relates to kind of where in this world space these psychedelic drugs take you, and then how we might even engineer molecules to access particular regions of this world space. So in a sense, there will become a point in the future perhaps where you can use a particular type of molecule to activate particular types of receptors in the brain with a certain balance, perhaps using drug combinations to actually access different regions of this overall world space. So it's I'm kind of on the second draft now, but as with my other book, I like to illustrate and design the whole thing myself.
Yeah, I really like the illustrations on the first one. Yeah. If you have not bought or checked out Alien Information Theory, I highly recommend it. I bought the hardcover when it came out. It actually sold out pretty fast. I know some people were having a tough time finding the hardcover.
You can get it now, no
problem. But what do you think? So instead of building alien worlds, maybe it's going to exploring alien worlds now, or?
I have a working title in my head, but I'm not revealing it.
All right. Well, when you come out with it, we'll definitely have you back on, obviously.
The subtitle is Psychedelics as Tools for the Discovery and Exploration of New Worlds. So that gives you a flavor of what the book is about.
All right. I like it. And I like the topics, too. And if you can explain it as well as you've explained some of these mechanisms here tonight, I think it'll be a real bestseller for the psychedelic community. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. If anybody's interested, we're going to record a Patreon. I'll probably upload it later tonight. And thank you so much for your time, Andrew. And we look forward to your future research and your book. And you're such a wealth of knowledge.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Peace, everybody. Peace. And we love you. Stay safe out there.